This is a little introduction to this conversation that I had with a couple buddies from a certain corner of the internet. We talked about empathy and what exactly it is and how it differs from sympathy and compassion and a little bit pity as well, but mostly sympathy. Um, and yeah, it was a good conversation. They brought up some good points and gave me some good food for thought. Um, yeah, this video will serve as an introduction, you know, to an empathy series because I think it's very important now more than ever that we hone and develop um, our ability to have empathy or to deploy empathy. So yeah, we'll dive into it more more nichely later on, but for now, enjoy this conversation. Shoots.
They say I play too much. You right. They say I play too rough. You tight.
All right, you're good to go.
All right, cool. All right, so here we're a few days ago. There was a topic brought up on empathy, and I think it was in the book sharing, and I had mentioned a book I had read, which was against empathy, and it was not so much on the topic of removing empathy entirely, but of not letting it overtake you to the point where everyone else is dragging you down. So we wanted to discuss empathy, sympathy, compassion in this chat. And so, Tyler, what was your point we said earlier?
Yeah, so I guess the main two words that are often, I feel like, interchanged are empathy and sympathy. And that the basic definition of sympathy is when you have a similar feeling, so you're sharing the feeling, not in the sense that you are like experiencing this exact same thing as the other person, but that you, like, if you see someone who's angry, you know what it's like to be angry, and you can sort of identify that feeling and share it in the sense that you're having the same feeling. Whereas empathy is a much later term. I think it was a German psychologist or something who coined it, and then it came into English from the term that he came up with, and it was in like the early 20th century. So it's pretty new as far as words go, and it was feeling into, instead of, like, the sympathy comes from Greek and it just means with feeling, so this fellow feeling. And so it's like the idea is that you are actually experiencing those feelings along with the other person, so it's like more of like a direct experience, and that kind of tracks with what in that book you were talking about, where you're like taking those feelings of the other person onto yourself, and so it gets into this, like, the best example of the distinction between them that I can remember is, this was probably 2 years ago. There was that gymnastics coach who had been like molesting all those girls up in like Michigan or something.
Oh, I
And
don't remember that.
what's his name? Nasser, I think.
Okay.
And so then there was an article where one of the dads at the trial had like tried to like rush to and like attack him, and got like tackled by like the
Okay.
bailiffs and things like that. And the one of the articles I saw about it, the author starts out by saying, "Oh, I empathize with his wanting to attack this guy who molested his daughter, but," And to me, I was like, you can't say I empathize, but because you're taking on like the fullness of the experience of that person to yourself. And so to truly empathize with him would be to say that like you wish you were there because you would attack him too.
Yeah.
Whereas you could sympathize with the anger because you have been angry yourself.
Hmm.
But then, so you could say, I sympathize with his anger, but, that's inappropriate to do for, X, Y, and Z reasons. So
Yeah.
I think that's a really good example, I think, that distinguishes those two terms.
So I feel your pain and I understand what you're going through are completely different ideas. Because I feel your pain gets into gets into what I was talking about earlier of not letting the other person drag you into their feeling too much. And what we had said before Kalepa showed up uh, was something along the lines of it's kind of a starting point, but it's not the entire experience. You don't want to just empathize. And uh, it and I had said that it's a tool on your belt. It's not the whole toolbox. So, what are your thoughts on that? Colin?
So, a little disagreement, I guess. I would say that sympathy is appealing to emotion. Sympathy is feeling uh, what the other person is feeling. I have sympathy. It's an emotional experience. So where having empathy is, um, it's more to do with like understanding the framing. It's I can I just read something I wrote?
Yeah,
So
yeah, go for it.
did like an opener thing. So okay, the first one. Have you ever heard the phrase "I have no sympathy for dot dot dot"?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Next question. Have you heard it introed by "I get it, but I have no sympathy for dot dot dot"? Or does that make, if you haven't heard it, does that sound like it fits in?
Yeah.
I've
Like
never
I
heard
get
it,
it,
but that sounds
but I don't have sympathy.
contradictory.
Okay, let me move on then. Uh,
No, I mean, if that's something that
No,
if
they
that's part
sound
of the
like things that
disagreement.
would have been said.
Oh, sure, sure, sure.
Yeah.
I just
like
think it's
what
a misunderstanding of what sympathy is.
word? Okay, so that's what I was saying. Let me move on. Just read the rest
Yeah,
of this, and
yeah,
then
yeah,
we'll
go for it.
Yeah.
break it down. So empathy is a dynamic thing, and my main problem with the opposition to it is, besides wrongly defining it, that many people look at it simplistically or romantically, which is largely why it is confused with sympathy and compassion. Uh, Many imagine, or like many things, but the Trinity, for example, people just haven't put much thought into it and subconsciously imagine that some just have it. It just hits them out of nowhere and boom, they got it. They just see things others can't for reasons we know not of. Pretty much the post-enlightenment psychic who is safe from stake burnings in this modern world. Uh, a lot of other things make up empathy, or maybe instead a lot of steps requiring a lot of skills allow for empathy to be had at the end of a quest or what have you. It's reading the room, tone, and body language, keeping any foreknowledge of that person or situation or whatever it is in context, intently listening and hearing the subtext of what's being said, not just the foretext. Empathy also isn't butterflies and rainbows. Granted, most people understand that suffering can come from deploying too much empathy or from deploying empathy, but I mean it in a different way. It's not just seeing the good in people or seeing why people do things in a positive light to justify them. It's equally to see the bad in people as well, to understand how they became Nazis or serial killers or so on. Empathy is a large part of how detectives solve murders, how interrogators reveal lies, and how negotiators tap into what's driving the gunman or the person on the ledge. This side of empathy must also be juxtaposed with the other at all times, or else it's just naivety, as many criticisms for actually, uh, as many criticize empathy for actually being. And inversely, with only only this side, it's just cynicism and seeing the worst in everyone. So you got to juxtapose the seeing the good and the seeing the bad in empathy. It's both of those things are becoming clear to you. Extreme self-awareness is probably the biggest gateway to extreme empathy. Once you become aware of your effect on everything in each moment and how everything's affecting you, you begin to apply that to other people and how everything is affecting them. It sounds obvious and it is a base level, but being intentional about it is a whole other thing, and it's where the fruit is found. In closing, empathy is exactly what this world needs right now, and it is exactly what it is gravely lacking. So that's, I would just define empathy different. To where, so like if sympathy is this emotional kind, then to rightly understand empathy, I think it's important to understand how you have empathy, how you can have empathy. Yeah, it's where that's what differentiates it. Is it's a lot of different things coming together to create empathy.
Well, I think what at least I came out of the Against Empathy book wasn't it. Honestly, that's just a bad title because it's supposed to be provocative. Um, Against Empathy isn't really against empathy. Um, it's a cautionary tale against using it badly. It's against feeling something for someone that isn't also feeling that thing. It's just like I'm offended for you. It's just like that's a bad way to use empathy.
I would, yeah, but that's where I would just disagree with how he defined empathy and sympathy. Like, in my opinion, he has it backwards.
Well, yeah, but the way that the let's not we can go with dictionary definitions and then we can go with the way that it's used in the world, and I think that you're using the way that it's used in the world is the opposite of the way that you just define them.
What do you mean?
Can I jump in?
Go ahead.
Yeah. So the what you were describing sounds like compassion more, like, and then that's the
Compassion is a response.
yeah. So
It's the
I guess it
action
would right, and that's what kind of
from empathy or sympathy.
correct. That's exactly what I was going to say. So the way it's like empathy, and I think what the guy was saying from what Kevin described in the book is that it's like I'm against only empathy. Like if all you're doing is feeling empathy for people, then like you're not doing anything to help the people that you're claiming to empathize with, and you're just it can become, and that if you over empathize, then it can be disabling, because then
How,
you're just
how
kind
so?
of like drowning in all these other people's feelings, and you're never alleviating it, which is like that's the I would think that the utility of empathy is that then you can, from that base, then go out and try to have compassion by helping that person in that situation. And so,
Okay, what
like,
would sympathy going too far be?
sorry, can you repeat that?
What would detrimental sympathy be?
I,
If
I
if
don't
that's
think
what
it's,
empathy goes too far,
yeah.
you drown. That's what I'm poking at.
I think sympathy is just much more of a, um, you're just feeling things. So it's a very neutral kind of thing, and that's where it gets the misuse of it is in acting like sympathy means more than it really is. When it's all it is like you're having the same feeling that another person is having. So that's really just all it is you're having the feeling, and then you identify some other person or animal that you then project things onto, like, and then you just say, oh yeah, I sympathize with them. And so that, like, it almost is like there's nowhere to go from sympathy. You just sympathize because you just have feelings, and it's like, oh, okay, great. Like you're not really saying much. So it's one of those like platitudes where people just say like, oh, I sympathize with that. And it's like, okay, well, what, that doesn't really mean anything. That just means like I feel those emotions too sometimes. Like it's like, okay, great.
Yeah.
So,
it's describing something in the past that's just like, oh yeah, I felt like that before.
and I think that goes to your point, Kalepa, about people when they say they sympathize, they're thinking that means they're empathizing. But because they're actually sympathizing, that's why it doesn't spur them to do anything. It's just like a throwaway comment. And so that is where I think in the usage of the words, that is kind of how it ends up playing out, and kind of speaks to what you were saying. But I think empathy is often also falls prey to a similar thing, because, and that, I think that is because the terms are used interchangeably by a lot of people. And so both words can be used for the same situation where you're just not doing anything. And so you can use sympathy incorrectly in that circumstance, or you can empathize and then not do anything about it. And if that's the case, then were you really empathizing? Like that's where I feel like if you're truly empathizing, then that's just like the empathy is the trigger for then the actions that follow.
Well, because it becomes empathy can have physiological effects on you, and so a physiological effect of, say, somebody else being in pain would probably be you end up crying because that person is in pain, and you have they call they again with the sympathy empathy overcross, they call it sympathetic it's a sympathetic pains or something like that, where sometimes a husband being in the same room as his wife giving birth will have birth pains. And it's a physiological thing. That's more akin to empathy because you're physically like feeling the thing, but they call it a sympathy thing because that's just the technical term they're using.
Well, yeah, and I was gonna say, isn't that from like the sympathetic nervous system? Like,
yeah,
maybe the terms had just got like mixed up, and now like when they say that, it's coming from something else.
Yeah, because sympathy is usually talked about physically, where empathy is usually talked about psychologically. It's just like I am psychologically feeling the same things you're feeling about, and it's a mind-body problem of they're not bridging the gap between what's physical and what's mental. It's like it can be both. And so when they say a sympathetic pain, that what they're really meaning is an empathetic pain manifesting physically through the processes that you're going through, to the degree where a guy is having labor pains, and it's like, what is happening?
So yeah. I have something just along the lines of pain. I have something that I wanted to read, and it's a book about English synonyms. And so one of them is pity and compassion. So it says, the pain which one feels at the distresses of another is the idea that is common to the signification of both these terms. but they differ in the object that causes the distress. The former, which is pity, is excited principally by the weakness or degraded condition of the subject, the latter by his uncontrollable and inevitable misfortunes. We pity a man of a weak understanding who exposes his weakness. We compassionate the man who is reduced to a state of beggary and want. Pity is kindly extended by those in higher condition to such as are humble in their outward circumstances. The poor are at all times deserving of pity, even when their poverty is the positive fruit of vice. Compassion is a sentiment which extends to persons in all conditions. The Good Samaritan had compassion on the traveler who fell among the thieves. Pity, though a tender sentiment, is so closely allied to contempt that an ingenuous mind is always loath to be the subject of it, since it can never be awakened but by some circumstance of inferiority. It hurts the honest pride of a man to reflect that he can excite no interest but by provoking a comparison to his own disadvantage. On the other hand, such is the general infirmity of our natures, and such our exposure to the casualties of human life, that compassion is a pure and delightful sentiment that is reciprocally bestowed and acknowledged by all with equal satisfaction. So it makes me what that I always like that little like couple paragraphs on it, because I think where empathy comes in is that what it started as like, oh, I'm empathizing, as in empathy is better than sympathy. And I think that is true, but only because empathy is supposed to lead to compassion. But when you only empathize, when you just stop there, or like just kind of simple sympathy, you it often just turns into pity, where you look at people and you go, oh yeah, like I see that you're in this situation, like I would hate to be in that. It's kind of like similar to the like, oh, like the prayer of like, oh, thank you God, like I'm glad I'm not one of those miserable sinners like all these other people, where you start using your sympathy or this false empathy to look down on other people. And whereas if you see someone who is in a worse condition than you, then you would, if you're truly empathetic, then you would take the next step, and you would demonstrate that with your compassion.
So I it's a definition. We're Peterson Harrison it up right now.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I would like, I guess a way to boil it down would say empathy is like competent sympathy, informed sympathy. It's not to where sympathy is about this like feeling what they're feeling, understanding because you feel what they're potentially feeling, what emotion was invoked in you because of seeing this thing. That's more sympathy. To where empathy is like, okay, here's this homeless guy who's acting crazy right now or whatever. Um, he probably can't get a job because he doesn't have an address, or he's got some addiction, can't get help for that addiction because of this, that, and the other, this thing, this thing, this thing. He's bored all day. And so he's probably just like trying to fill his boredom with drinking alcohol or some kind of high, just because you're bored all day. You have nothing to do. He's a bit standoffish towards me because most people don't like him and don't treat him great. Authority figures probably run him off, and it depends where you're at. If you're in Hawaii, then like you'll even get like kicked awake and like, that kind of stuff. It's the keeping all of that in mind that allows me to have empathy and say, I really don't agree with what you're doing, but I get it. I get why this is happening. It doesn't justify what is happening, but it lets you have an understanding of why this is occurring, why this person is doing this, why this came to be, why it's deploying empathy to reach that competency. And so that's why I brought in the detective and the negotiator and stuff. It's like a skill set to better understand. And
Yeah,
then
Yeah.
from there,
that
you have the ability to better use compassion in an effective way, in an effective manner.
and that does. So one thing that I have heard is that like and it goes along with the detective or hostage negotiator idea, is that serial killers are highly empathetic, but that
Hmm.
they lack all sympathy, and it allow that super high empathy is what makes them effective in their trade or their
Strategy
craft,
and
right?
yeah.
Like they
Because
stalk
they
their
know what
victims,
hurts.
and they know what hurts, and they can similar to like uh torture experts, right? Like they have a high degree of empathy but no sympathy, and it's because they can put themselves in the mind of their prey and know what they're going to do, and so
Yeah.
therefore they can be one step ahead of them. And so I think that does go along with the what you're saying, and so I'm unclear on the where we disagree other than just the definition, but it seems like the way that we're talking about it, the way that we sort of analyze it seems pretty in line. And so like to me much that's like it matters more than like, oh, this is how I define it, right? Like
Yeah.
we're not writing a
Well,
dictionary, we're talking about human interaction and
Yeah.
that. And so I
The
think
well,
I'm
let's
tracking with what you're saying.
yeah.
visualize it. So would like a timeline be sympathy, empathy, compassion? It's like where the compassion is the interaction to help.
It could be interchangeable as
Yeah.
far as sympathy and empathy. You could be struck by this emotion that makes you deploy empathy, like, oof, whoa, that was, you know, and then going into like, okay, why is this? To where someone without empathy would just have this emotional feeling and they may take action. That was a thing I didn't necessarily agree with, of like the inaction from sympathy. It's just that the action is not competent. It's not well informed, and so it's just this emotional response of like, yeah, I'm gonna uh, buy a pair of Toms because it's gonna give uh, kids free shoes, and they need shoes. It's where if you have the correct understanding of like, whoa, there's shoe stores over there. That's a whole business. This is not. Yeah, that's just an example, but it's misplaced sympathy because of a lack of empathy. So, but going back to your thing, it can be either or of like seeing all of this, uh, how it works, like just seeing like, oh, this is why this happened, and then boom, that strikes you with a strong emotional response, and then you begin the verb of compassion,
Mm.
or vice versa.
Yeah,
But I
like
So
think
what you said about
compassion's the end.
like sympathy is just a it's like an in the same way as empathy, where you don't like you don't have like a thought and then like it's just the feeling, it's like the thing that strikes you,
Boom, boom.
right?
Yeah,
And where so like that's where they're similar, but then I think sympathy is much more common in this, like whereas like everybody has sympathy and in some form, like
yeah,
you'll sympathize with things, whereas empathy, like you were saying, is more something that you can hone and like really it's deployable, whereas sympathy is just going to be your feelings
To
that you're
experience that.
that
Yeah.
you're yeah, exactly. And so if you see an advertisement for some like, marketing thing, like, oh, buy our mattress and we'll plant a tree somewhere. And it's like, okay, so like you can say, oh, no, I'm sympathizing with the rainforest, or like it just like it doesn't really make sense. And you can use sympathy to rationalize behaviors that you wanted to do anyway. And so it's, whereas the empathy has a much more of like a causal link with the action that then happens, and you can empathize for good or for evil in those ways that we just talked about. And so yeah, I just, when people say they empathize, though, it's sort of like, where you can like a propositional belief, right? You can say, oh no, I'm empathizing with them, but then it's like, well, what did you do about it? Because if you didn't really do anything, then I kind of think that you were just sympathizing, and you just used the word empathy because in your mind you think of empathy as this higher form of sympathy, when I think they're more they're categorical distinctions. Like, they're not on the same spectrum. There's sympathy and then there's empathy, uh, and and so like the compassion is
A
is
proper
the
result.
right, and you can sympathize with something and then have compassion for that person, but I wouldn't see those as being like the sympathy caused the compassion. I would think more like you had, and that's where, like you were saying, Kalepa, about if you can have that feeling, but then through your skill of empathy, you can then convert that sympathy into compassion. Even though
Yeah.
it's like, whereas if you're like empathy, if you are like a therapist, right? Like you're
Super necessary.
exactly. And so you're going into it ready to empathize because that's your job, in order to then help that person. And so whereas sympathy, it's just like you said, like it's just like it hits you and but whereas if you're kind of like you're already in the mindset of empathizing, then you're going to be able to convert that into the compassion much more readily than sympathy, which is just kind of like, oh yeah, I feel that.
Okay, so if we put this on like two tracks, uh, the way that you guys just described that back and forth would kind of be empathy and empathy and sympathy are at the same point. The difference is one is informed. And so the compassion that comes out at the other end is either informed or uninformed compassion. And whereas sympathy would probably end up being uninformed compassion, and empathy would be informed compassion that would come out at the other side. But both done wrong or done nothing with would just be pity.
I
or
don't
Yeah.
I don't think you
positive
can I don't think you can
or negative.
sympathize wrong, because it's not really in your control. Does that make
Okay.
sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Sympathy can lead you astray. Might be a better way of saying that.
Well, I would say
Yeah.
if you're emotionally unstable,
Yeah.
then like your sympathy is just, it's like you're going to be like like uh
Well, both
like
can lead you down a bad path.
you're like emotionally ADD. Like you're
Mhm.
just like, oh, I sympathize with that. Now I sympathize with this. And so, but because it's just like all of these emotions are just hitting you from one moment to the next. And so I suppose, but I wouldn't say that's like you're sympathizing wrongly. You're just sort of not good at
Well,
maintaining your control over your emotions.
I think there's a depth. I think there's a depth difference that you just brought in there. Because if you sympathize easily, then you would sympathize a lot. But if you if you empathized easily, then you would have deeper feelings more. And so if you empathize too much, you would have way too much into these deep feelings, and it would impact you in a deeper, more destructive way if it went wrong. But if you sympathize too much, you just wouldn't have any focus in your sympathy.
The potentially the only alleviation you have though with empathy is uh, a lot of other stuff to kind of divide that burden,
Mm-hmm.
because it isn't just this like overwhelming emotional thing that's just like I have no idea what to do with this, or where like it's at least with an understanding of like, and yeah, that can lead to, if you see the whole system that led to this thing, it can be very it's like Ecclesiastes, I don't know the chapter and verse, but with much wisdom comes much sorrow, and with much knowledge comes um, grieving, or something like that. It's a similar thing to that of like, if you see it, you see it. Pandora's box has been opened. What are you going to do with that? So yeah, I would say that's true, but there's at least some stuff to grip onto instead of just this overwhelming like emotional, I have no idea what to do with this crap.
Yeah.
One thing I was going to say real quick,
Mm-hmm.
a different way to think of empathy, um, might be a little confusing because we've been talking about emotion, but like Gary Vaynerchuk uh, will call it like emotional intelligence, EQ.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's the bringing together of heady knowledge and emotion. So that I was thinking about that just a minute ago, and it does make it a little more interconnected in that
Yeah.
sense.
It's
But
informed emotion.
yeah,
Yeah.
but it's also like Charlie and Jacob have been talking about recently of like multiple, just brought it up multiple times of like some people can't lift weights, and that's just not everyone can do that. Some people have, are this way, some people are this way, and some people can draw super good, some people have voices that are crazy, some people, all that stuff. And I would say that emotional intelligence is another one of those things that like some people just have more of that, and some people are more I don't know, this is
So
some people are more sympathetic, but
I can't sign on to the idea of emotional intelligence
Mhm.
for statistical reasons, but
Yeah.
but I understand what people mean when they say it. My
Yeah.
my issue with it is that the the idea that you can be more, that some people are more emotionally intelligent, is that then it's like, oh well, you're either born with it or you're not. And I'll grant that, okay, yes, for let's say personality reasons or your
Temperament.
your life history, that you might, some people are more emotionally sensitive to things, or they pick up more on what other people are feeling. And then at the same time, similar to like the lifting weights analogy, well, you can train yourself to be more empathetic, and
Totally.
and like, but it's, and that's why you can, that's, isn't that the reason that psychologists, therapists, that they have to go through schooling and certification and all of these things, is because like, if it was just a straight up like, oh, who has the highest
You got
emotional
it or you don't.
intelligence,
Yeah.
we'll hire
Yeah.
them, right?
Yeah.
Like, but I don't think it really works that way. And so that's like the double-edged sword of the emotional intelligence
Well,
analogy, is
I
that
don't.
if it's tied too closely to like the the formal idea of like intelligence. But again, I'll grant that when most people use it, they're not talking about that, right? They're talking about having an emotional skillfulness.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think
I
IQ
would
skills a little bit too,
attribute it
doesn't it?
more to skill, because what I think we're talking about is like the IQ at birth question is just like, no, I
Or
don't think
yeah.
that's accurate. I think you can actually learn a lot of this stuff,
Yeah,
and it's
but
just harder for some people to learn some emotional intelligence than others. But I think you can get to a degree where that is viable. That's like you can have. Uh, so something popping up right now is that there's a guy online that's he every time somebody disagrees with him, he checks to see whether or not they're an artist. and and because what what he brings up is that artists have a harder time seeing the world that is, not the world that could be. And so it's just like, so every time somebody disagrees with him, he'll just say hashtag artist because he looks into their profile and they say what they've done and all this other thing, which is funny
he has
because
a point, but I
he
would go with
himself is he himself is an artist, but um, but
sounds like an
he
artist thing to do.
but he went through training to be able to see the world as it is, and
Yeah.
so um, and and I don't know if I would call myself an artist, but I'm a writer, and I have noticed in myself issues in is oughts of like, man, I really wish that the world was like this, and I keep trying to treat it like that, and it's just like, no, but that's not how it really is, and I through having to deal with that, I find it really difficult to operate in the world. Hence, I'm in my parents' house. But the the thing that I've come to realize in a lot of, say, these kind of dialogues, or Paul, or anyone else, is that um, finding out how the world is not impossible. You
Yeah.
can learn these things. You can train yourself into the knowledge of it. And so I would, it's to what you were talking about, Caleb, with empathy being more informed, is that I wouldn't call it emotional intelligence. I would call it informed emotion.
Word. Um, I would say uh, my the reason that I do stick up for empathy when it's not like it's the opposition. All those words are very loaded and very like above, uh, but just the opposition to the focus or the highlighting, the lifting up, the hey everyone come look at this thing that we should probably do better at.
Yeah.
Um,
Improvement, not
I
worship.
get, yeah, I get the opposition to it of like, we're such a fatty society. We're such a trendy society, where these buzz words come up, or these coconut oils, or these, there's all these different stuff that's like, yeah, that'll be here and gone next month. Um, so I get that, but this fact of the ability to develop empathy or emotional intelligence or informed emotion is that's why I stand up for it and stick up for it, is because it isn't just this uh, character trait that's given, hereditary character trait or something. It's a developable thing if you're intentional about it, if you're um, yeah, if you want to develop it. But I will say that there's definitely um, the people that's temperament are have a huge head start, like bodybuilding, like or lifting weights in general, just athleticism. There's people that are just their short twitch and long twitch muscles, or fast twitch and short twitch muscles, are just really much more developed, and like they can go farther than me and my long muscles will ever be able to go. You know, like I'm 6'4", I have to go twice the distance with bench or whatever. Like it's just not gonna happen as much. I can still get strong and be able to bench and be able to do whatever and lift stuff. Not to that extent though. So there's still some scale to it. But yes, it is most definitely developable, and that's like my exactly. You know, that's why I am a ambassador for it, I guess, because I think that it's something that a lot of people, are, especially this year, more and more. Um, if you know, there's just a lot of with empathy. It's the informed side of it, of like understanding the people that you disagree with, why they think that way. Actually, steel man, why they think that way. Because there's just it can lead to a lack of empathy, can lead to like a romantic thought of like evil people are evil because they're evil. They do evil things because they are evil, not because they're the good guys in their minds, like fully, like the framing, like it's not just some thinly veiled, yeah, we're the good guys, right? Like, no, they through and through believe it, just as you do, just so. I think that, yeah, the championing of empathy needs to be done correctly, obviously, but I think it's quite the powerful tool for us to
informed empathy.
yeah, take it another step further.
Yeah.
but that's something I don't like, these sub words.
Yeah.
Like it's like love, because of the way that we treat love in our culture. People will talk about love being detrimental or love being a bad thing.
Yeah, I
And I'm
can't
like,
stand the way love
no, that doesn't,
is talked about.
but it can't. Like it's not love then. You know, like cool that there's this thing that was detrimental. It's not love, because love is this purity thing, this pure kind. So it's a similar thing of that with some different stuff that we.
I think Vervaeke just had a bit of an outburst the other day, and he said it was like one of his best talks recently, and he was just kind of riffing, like he was explaining his entire like course set in one video, and it was fascinating, but he got to the point of love and you just saw him get angry because he said love is not an emotion. He's just like, thank you. I really appreciate you saying that. Yeah, but yeah, there's a lot of stuff that we try to over categorize, but it also comes with the what is it called, vernacularization of these terms, to the degree where we have completely gray zoned the difference between sympathy and empathy to the degree where they're like swappable.
Yeah.
It's so
that's the swappability is, I think, because empathy gained this heightened status where you can use it, but what you're really doing is you're not empathizing. You're just saying that you're empathizing because it makes you look good, because people have this idea that like, oh, empathy is better than sympathy, and it is, but it's like the proof of your empathy will be in what you do next, not in your stating of having empathy. So just in line with Paul's most recent video, do not take the name empathy in vain. And
word, yeah.
And so, yeah. Do you guys have any last things to any closing statements you want to make?
was a good conversation. I don't know.
Yeah,
Got a
I
lot
had
out
a
there.
I had a great time. That was that went a lot better than I thought it would because I'm woefully unprepared for this talk because I don't have that book anymore. I
More
gave
Well, I
it to
mean,
my
it's
brother.
we don't have to have an academic conversation.
Yeah, yeah,
It's more like everyone I think has come into contact with these words, and they know they kind of have this. It's almost better that way because everyone kind of thinks they know what the words mean because they have had experiences of both of them. Like I would
hmm
imagine every person has. I mean, everybody always is sympathizing with somebody or something. And then
yeah.
I would say most people have empathized with other people before. And so it's just like, it's fun to kind of drill down on those and talk about them. I have one short little thing that I just want to read that I
Okay.
think is interesting. So compassion is altogether a moral feeling which makes us enter into the distresses of others. We may therefore sympathize with others without essentially serving them. But if we feel compassion, we naturally turn our thoughts towards relieving them. And so that's where I think the the word empathy is not in there, but I think it is in the sense that it's the 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 bedrock of the compassion that would necessarily cause you to serve others.
Mhm.
Yeah,
And
yeah, I'd
I
agree.
think in society, sympathy has become the negative form of pity, to where when you hear sympathy, you think, "Don't pity me." That kind of feeling of just like no, it's it's what's that word? Condescending
Mm.
to
Yeah.
when you hear it, when you
And
hear, "Oh, I
it's I think
sympathize."
it's because sympathy is usually just it's by its nature is empty and fleeting. And so when people they have this idea of sympathy that is empathy, and so then therefore when they hear somebody telling them that they sympathize, but then they don't see the compassion from them, then they say, "Oh, well, you must actually pity me, and
Or
you must hold me in contempt because otherwise you would have done something to help me."
yeah, or if they poke at it, at you saying that and saying like, what do you mean? Like, what do you? And they don't have any. There's no like, well, I've seen that you went through this, you experienced this, this happened, or some kind of empathy to explain that feeling. They're just kind of like,
Yeah,
Just
like, "Oh,
yeah,
you still
you
don't
don't really
understand you don't
you
get
don't
it
really
still.
care."
Or
yeah,
yeah, or at least
yeah.
you don't get it.
Hmm.
Like maybe you do care, but you don't get it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
Cool. All right, I'm going to stop the recording now.
Yeah.
Yo, so I just realized that I never talked about the book that I read that started the conversation. Applied Empathy. I can't remember. I can't remember the author's name, um, but he's the founder and like sub or the founder and CEO of Sub Rosa, I believe, and some other companies. Uh, but I was put onto him through Gary Vaynerchuk, I believe, when I used to pay attention to Gary a lot more. But it was a great book, and there's a ton of really valuable, really important information in there. Just in a different way to run a company or run an organization, or yeah. So I just wanted to add this at the end. I hope you liked the conversation. And yeah, I'll see you in the coming videos on empathy. Shoot.